Welcome back to bonus coverage of the Farm Progress Show, day number 1 here in Boone, Iowa. And joining us now is Dan Froehlich, Director of Agronomy for Mosaic, who also, among his many other talents, is a restaurant connoisseur who has also been able to direct me to some great pork ribs here in Iowa, and we enjoyed them last night. Thank you very much. I was stuffed after having a full rack.
Yeah, it's for me, it's always a trip out of the way to make sure I go through Ames and hit that restaurant every time I can.
Thank you very much for the tip. My waistline doesn't thank you, but the rest of me does thank you. All right. We got a lot to talk about, some agronomic issues. Let's talk about a corn project you have with the University of Illinois. 300 bushel corn. That's kind of that magic number that sits out there. Tell us about this particular project.
Yeah, we started a project about 2 years ago with the University of Illinois trying to drive to that 300 bushel, which isn't really that magic. We're actually shooting more for 350 bushel. But it's a project where we look at multiple factors at the same time. Instead of just like changing plant population, we're looking at 5 different factors at the same time and trying to raise that yield bar up.
Yeah, 300 is not unheard of, but can it become more common than it has been?
Yeah, we're trying to make it has to be sustainable and economically feasible for the farmer. So the first goal is to get to the 300 bushel and then make sure that the economics make sense.
And how are you going to do that?
Well, we look at 5 different factors. So we kind of the baseline, the traditional treatment is what university recommendations would be for plant population, for P&K applications, for nitrogen applications. And then, so that's the base. And then we do what we call a high-tech treatment where we're looking at an extra 100 pounds of nitrogen using a stabilized nitrogen. And we use an extra 100 pounds of phosphate. And in our case, we're using our Micro Essentials SZ product so that we can get the sulfur and the zinc along with the phosphorus. We also look at higher plant populations. So instead of 32,000, we're looking at 45,000 plants per acre. We're looking at a triple stack hybrid. We want that corn rootworm gene along with the BT and the Roundup. And then we're also looking at a fungicide. And we care a little bit about the fungicide from the standpoint of disease control, but we really want the growth regulators contained within that.
You know, we talk a lot about how much more we can produce on fewer acres all the time anymore, or at least even on the same amount of acres, and that's a key as we move forward. And there are a lot of questions, just is there a ceiling on this, or what can we reach? What are your thoughts?
Well, the latest number that I've heard on genetic potential for corn is 503 bushel, is what it should be capable, mathematically what it's capable of doing. And that takes a very healthy plant population, maybe a different row spacing, maybe you need 20-inch rows, maybe you need twin row to get the standability that you need with that as well.
It could be what we'll be talking about one of these days. You know, triple stack hybrids are becoming more and more popular. What, though, do we need to think about as far as the nutrient needs for those?
Now, one thing that we found out of this study was our yield level with the high-tech package versus traditional. We had 66 bushel higher yields with the doing everything kind of at a high level. Using the corn, just a corn borer Roundup trait versus the triple stack with the rootworm gene, and we saw a different nutrient uptake pattern. We did grain analysis on how much all the nutrients that were being removed. We had a 14% higher yield with the triple stack versus the double, but the nitrogen took about 14% more, as you'd expect, but the phosphorus had 24% more uptake, and the zinc was 27%, which suggests that we need more phosphorus and zinc in particular to drive those high yields out of those newer varieties.
I mean, that's the key. If we're going to keep getting more and more production out of this land, that means we're taking more out of the soil too. I mean, we're going to have to put back.
Yeah, you're going to have to pay it sometime. We've been mining the soils a lot over the last 3-4 years, particularly when the phosphorus and potash prices went very high a couple of years ago. So we've been mining those soils a lot. We're going to draw those down below that critical level pretty quickly. The other issue with the critical level that we found through this study is if the critical level is 20 or 22 parts per million for phosphorus, if you're going after those ultra-high yields, you need to have those soil test levels 25, maybe even up to 30 parts per million to make that happen.
We've talked about this before. I mean, farmers have had to look at some things like maybe could we cut some cost here or there with high input costs. But as you said, you can't keep doing that on a regular basis. I mean, you might get away with that, a year or two, but you have to put back.
Yes, you do. And the other critical thing is to make sure you keep those nutrients in balance. So, the tendency was to keep the nitrogen rates higher because you see those differences, especially after a wet year we've had this year. But if you don't keep your P&K levels up, your nitrogen uptake efficiency goes down considerably as well. So you're spending money on the nitrogen but throwing it away.
We're talking with Dan Froehlich, Director of Agronomy for Mosaic. Let's talk about this harvest that's getting underway now. We know conditions are all over the board. I think there's going to be some great corn. I think there's going to be some pretty common corn. Is that what you're seeing as you go around?
Yeah, what we're kind of seeing overall is when you get north of I-80 through central Iowa, where the crop isn't flooded out, it looks very good. And as you get up into southern Minnesota, we'll see a lot of 300 bushel corn in southern Minnesota. It's just fantastic. As you get south of I-80, it looks a lot more variable, and it's a kind of a combination of having too much water at one point and then it got too dry in the other areas. So it's going to be highly variable.
I've seen a lot of corn with the wet conditions we've had. It's like a lot of corn. There was a lot of nitrogen leaching. We lost a lot of nitrogen. You see a lot of that pale green, what a lot of people call Mountain Dew looking corn.
Yeah, we not only have we lost a lot of nitrogen, but we've lost a lot of sulfur as well. And we know as we're driving these yields up, we need more sulfur. We're not applying enough. The organic matter's not making it available enough. So we're seeing earlier in the season, we saw areas where we saw sulfur, zinc, and manganese deficiencies it was kind of all together. We think that's what the deficiencies were, and now we're seeing the nitrogen really starting to fire up.
Good news, bad news. Good news, not as wet as last year. Everyone would, finding those dryers they hadn't used in a long time. Drying costs were way up. It was a wet crop coming out. This year, we're already hearing that those moisture levels are much, much lower. That's usually good news, but could it be too low? Could it be drying out too much, too fast?
Well, I think particularly in the southern half of the Corn Belt, the crop is finishing way too fast. What you really want to see is gaining on having more heat units than normal up to pollination time, maybe an extra 100 growing degree days than normal, so that you get that crop moving and switched over to reproductive faster. But then you really want the crop to slow down after pollination so you get a longer grain fill period. That really hasn't happened this year.
Dan, what do you suggest to farmers or recommend to them? What notes, what lessons should they be taking from this harvest as they look ahead to next year's planting?
Well, I think the big thing is to make sure that you take your time getting the crop off. We've heard some southern Iowa, kind of southern Illinois, where the crop's already down to 14 to 18% moisture, so you got to get that out. I guess don't get in too big of a hurry. Make sure you get as much of your fertilizer down in the fall as possible. We've experienced wet springs the last few years where it's difficult to get out there and you cause some compaction that can be an issue. And we're going to have to start fertilizing a lot heavier than we are. And fertilizer prices are pretty good right now. A lot of people locked in early. And I would highly suggest getting that fertilizer down and then come back with your nitrogen next spring in particular.
Hopefully the weather will cooperate, and with an earlier harvest for some, that might allow more fall field work.
Yeah, we think there will be a much longer application window, and get some of that primary tillage if you're not in a no-till or reduced till. Get some of that done so that you're set up for next spring to be able to get in there. The other issue that we have is the corn got a lot taller this year than normal, which means you're going to have a lot more residue. It could keep the ground a little wetter, a little cooler in the spring as well.
So there are a lot of lessons to be learned this fall, looking ahead to what will impact next year's crop.
Yeah, I think the winter meetings will be a lot of new information with kind of the unusual year that we've had and lessons that we've learned, hopefully can sort out when did we get the high yields and why did your neighbor not get them or other way around.
The bottom line is you can't just keep taking out of these soils without putting back.
Exactly. It's the corn's going to pull off so much N, P, and K, and you have to supply that. The soil's not going to supply all that the crop needs, especially early in the season. So even if you have high levels, you probably still need to be adding particularly phosphorus along with your nitrogen to get that crop started quickly.
And the right products to enhance those inputs to make sure you get the most out of it.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is we start driving the yields up higher, we need to start worrying about the secondary nutrients like sulfur and the micronutrients, particularly zinc. The next one that's going to be limiting is probably boron in corn production.
Because, again, it's that two-sided coin. These yields keep going up, which we need for that to happen, but to maintain that, to keep pushing up, we're going to have to keep putting back.
Yeah, you'll get to a point if you're not adding back, you're going to get to a level, and maybe that's 250, maybe it's 300 bushel. But if we're not replenishing that soil and supplying the crop what it needs, it'll crash very hard, and you could lose all the gains that you had pretty quickly.
Don't want that to happen, certainly. So need to make good notes this fall, get as much done. Hopefully the weather will permit, and then be ready to go next year.
That's right.
All right, Dan, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Always good to talk with you. Dan Froehlich, Director of Agronomy for Mosaic. And again, those are some key agronomic issues to keep in mind as we get into this year's harvest and look ahead already to next planting season next spring. All right, with that, we will wrap up our bonus coverage here on opening day of the Farm Progress Show. Big crowd, even seeing a little bit of sun starting to peek through. That's a welcome sight as well. 2 more big days still to go here in Boone, Iowa. We'll be telling you more about it right here on AgriTalk Online and our regular AgriTalk broadcasts on our stations across the country as well. Thanks for joining us from Boone, Iowa. This is AgriTalk Online.